Hi, Nancy.
Hi, Shane.
It's been a while since we've
I
done this.
know. It has been a while. How you
And
doing?
good. It's good to see you. We live kind of close to each other, but winter is kind of rough seeing
Qu-
folks,
In the
especially now.
quarantine,
I
yes.
know. Well, so we're coming back today with an episode about. Well, let me just ask you. So, what's one of your favorite things to do, Nancy? What's one of your favorite hobbies?
Reading.
You love to read. I think one of our previous episodes you said that you'd want like a book on an island if that's the only thing you could take with you.
Probably,
or a
yeah.
or a library somehow. What's some of your favorite genres to read? What kind of stuff do you like?
I love just general fiction. I really like historical fiction.
What define
You know.
historical fiction?
Well, it's like something that happens in history, but it's a fictionalized account. It's like made up people usually, or it could be a real person, but they kind of make up, what happened to them because the evidence is sparse. But it takes place around something that really happened, like a war, or there's a lot of that, like World War II stuff. Anything really.
Have you ever have you ever like gotten into like the Civil War stuff?
A little bit. I'm not a huge Civil War buff, but around here there's a lot of Civil War stuff,
Yeah,
around
yeah,
our
I know we live in
area.
Virginia. Well,
Yeah.
lucky for you, we're gonna be talking about a little bit of that today.
Oh, great. Maybe I'll learn something.
Welcome to the American Geophysical Union's podcast about the scientists and the methods behind the science. These are the stories you won't read in a manuscript or hear in a lecture. I'm Shane Hanlon.
And I'm Nancy Bompey.
And this is Third Pod from the Sun. So, Nancy, it's lovely to catch up with you, even if it is virtually, and we could just like see each other outside by walking 20 minutes. But the reason why I asked you specifically about your hobbies and I guess historical fiction, which I'm interested to learn more about, is that we talked with someone for today's interview who has is a scientist, but has a connection to the Civil War.
So my name is Max Torbenson. I'm a postdoc at the Ohio State University um, in the civil engineering department. And my background is quite diverse. I have a PhD in geosciences, a master's in geography, and an undergraduate in archaeology. And I guess what ties all those things together is tree rings. So we're using tree rings to study past environments and climates. So that's how I try to sell that all these things are connected.
How did you make the transition from your PhD in more geospace area to civil engineering? Like you said, tree rings, but what is that connection?
At Ohio State, there's a big focus on water management. And so everything from bridges and building bridges to um, looking at floods and drought. And one of the things that tree rings can do is to reconstruct climate, and in this case, stream flow back in time. So my advisor there was looking for someone with the skill sets, paleoclimatic reconstruction.
This sounds like a kind of perfect fit for what Max would be doing and the kind of project that his advisor put him on.
Starting around 1855, so slightly before the U.S. Civil War, especially the central U.S., but probably the continent as a whole, experienced unusually low rainfall. So from 1855, 1856, for another 10 years or so, there was persistent drought across North America, but especially in the central part, so northern Texas, Oklahoma, Kansas. And we know this from historical accounts, we know this from tree ring studies, and from climate model simulation. And this drought was on par, or perhaps even worse in places than the Dust Bowl drought of the 1930s. And it's thought, for example, to have played a role in the near extinction of the American bison. So people moved into the plains around this time, and the grazing animals were kind of pushed aside from the good spots of or the good grass, and then on top of that was a big drought. So it's thought to have played a significant role in that.
And did it? It's the Civil War drought more because of the timing. It was in that time.
That's correct. Yeah.
Did it have, or do we even have an inkling of whether or not this is true? Did it have an effect on the Civil War itself, like where troops were, how they advanced, how they were affected, and how that might have actually altered the course of the war and like the history behind it?
So that's always kind of iffy.
Mm-hmm.
You're almost bordering on environmental determinism, right?
Mm-hmm.
When you're trying to, but there were definitely years during the war that were dry, and there's historical accounts of in Tennessee where some of the troops couldn't get supplies because they transported downriver and so on. But I think the effect or the drought itself was most severe in the central U.S. So, and the war, in the 1862, 1863 was the big battles, and were mainly in eastern United States. So the kind of trans-Mississippi theater of the war, there were battles in Oklahoma and Arkansas. That's probably, if it had an impact, that would be where that impact would
Okay. So maybe, but since the war was occurring and I'm in DC area, so like my part of the country more so, less effect of the drought there than where it was really hitting hard.
Yeah. That would be my, and again, it's likely that it had some effect, but because again, this was the driest decade that we know of in Texas, Oklahoma, Kansas, and Arkansas. So it's likely that it had some effect, but probably I wouldn't go as far as say that it had an impact on the outcome.
Gotcha. So you said we know from like different accounts of like from folks that this happened. Who was recording at the time? Are these just like first person narratives of just people who lived in the areas? Were these were they like white people? Were they Native Americans? Like what types of groups were recording these things?
There is a wealth of information, and including actual historical, what we now call instrumental data. So in the kind of frontiers, there were forts that were stationing soldiers, and they had some sort of, or they had instrumentation or measured how much rain fell. Kerry Mock is a climate historian, has done work in the central U.S. on this. But we also have newspaper accounts. We have some of the Native American tribes in the Great Plains used pictograms, so painting.
Like drawing and carvings. And
Exactly. And different symbols meant different things, and there have been interpretations suggesting that, for example, 1855 is known as the sitting summer, and that has been interpreted in combination with other records that have been a very dry year.
Okay, so it was like everyone was documenting it, both from a scientific perspective. Basically, it was affecting everyone, and there's a good record of it.
Yeah, definitely. And again, this is a time in that part of the continent where European immigrants were just starting to. So the 1850s is kind of where we're starting to see expansion. westwards in there. So, and that, again, in combination with a drought, is thought to have played a role in how local wildlife, including the bison, was able to get on. I think the results suggest that places outside of this core region, they have experienced a kind of waxing and waning influence of ENSO on local droughts. So places like Arizona, Southern California, Eastern Texas. So for certain periods, ENSO plays an important role on drought probability, while for other periods, it's not much of a relationship at all. And what that also means is that those changes that we've seen in the instrumental data for the 20th and 21st centuries, those type of changes appear to have been a somewhat stable feature of climate dynamics in the past 350 years. And in terms of the Civil War drought, so the Civil War drought occurred during persistent La Nina conditions. It doesn't necessarily mean that ENSO caused the drought. Well, it probably did to a certain degree, but it definitely played a role in the intensity and persistence, and also the spatial imprint. So the fact that for those 10 years, so 1855 to 64, a lot of the U.S., the continental U.S., was in drought conditions of various magnitude. The kind of final thing there is that these expansions and contractions of ENSO influence, especially into the Great Plains, which was where the Civil War drought really hit the hardest. We speculate that those expansions and contractions could be tied to conditions in the Atlantic Ocean.
These sites you're on, are they public land? Are they private sites? What type of permissions do you need to get to do this type of work?
They can be all sorts, and I've been very fortunate, especially during my PhD, to travel and work in all over the U.S. and Mexico and Brazil and South America. So it kind of depends on where you are. And again, if you're on public land, you usually need permission from, let's say it's a national park or a state park, and there are private landowners that are really interested in knowing the history of their own land and understanding their surroundings better. So usually that's not a problem. And of course, some of these sites are more remote than others. But yeah, I've definitely had people come up to me asking me what I'm doing and why I'm hurting the tree.
Have you had any like especially antagonistic interactions with folks?
No, I can't say. To be honest, most people have been very good and interested. I think most people are interested in this. I've heard stories, and there are obviously, you always want to get permission before. Sure. And sometimes that might actually be tougher sometimes to get the permission to core, because they can be in places where wildlife tends to be connected where they don't really want any major disturbance. Sure. So
I was interested in the interactions he had with people, because sometimes he was on private land, sometimes on public land, but also he's out in the field in some really interesting locations and had some, let's say, unsavory interactions with some wildlife.
Looking back at the field, I always want to go back. But then obviously when you're there, especially early when I started, you think that you can do more than you actually can, right? I had a pretty bad spider bite out in Oregon when I just moved to the U.S. and I was kind of new, and I also had some sort of I still don't know what it was, but it was either a bite or a reaction to something in the Amazon,
Oh, wow.
where I had a red pattern started creeping up my arm that looked like along my veins, which was, yeah.
Oh, man. And so did you have to go to like the hospital? Or I guess if you're in the Amazon, I don't know if you have that available, but
we had gone back to civilization, so to say, when this started happening, but I was young and dumb, and unfortunately, nothing really came of it. But the pictures look kind of grim now in hindsight.
So it sounds like he's been all over the world doing this kind of work, which
Mhm.
is super cool. And then I guess wound up in the States.
So you touched on this, but so you're not from the States.
Yeah, I'm from Sweden originally, so.
What drew you here? Was it the work specifically you were doing in your lab? Was it something else? What really got your interest, not only in the States, but like specifically this type of work that you ended up doing?
My undergraduate degree was in archaeology, and so slightly different.
Yeah.
And there, people use tree rings to date artifacts or date buildings, or and I fell in love with tree rings during my undergraduate, and I realized that I wanted to continue to study, but I wanted to do it in an English-speaking country, because a lot of the European countries where tree rings are used it's either Germany or Switzerland or Spain. And I got an offer to do a master's at the University of Minnesota. It's been a journey, right? And I think that I've been, again, fortunate. Everyone's been so nice to me. I consider Arkansas probably more home than anywhere else right now. It was a bit of a change moving to the U.S., and I think that first step is probably the toughest, right? Sometimes you kind of just have to do it. And of course there are cultural differences, and I keep seeing them, but overall, and what really strikes me when people ask me why I love the U.S. is that it's so diverse, especially from my point, from an environmental standpoint. You can be in Arkansas and look at post oaks and bald cypress trees that are 1,000-year-old, and you can, if you don't like that, you can go to California and be up in the mountains, look at bristlecone pine, and the redwoods, and the oaks up in Minnesota, or wherever. You have everything.
Talking with Max really made me kind of appreciate not necessarily just nature, but I guess trees. I'm more of an animal guy, and so I never really thought about. I don't constantly think about trees a lot and how important they might be.
They're really important, and like we said, we were chatting a little bit before about being outside in the quarantine, and that's one of the kind of the things that you can do is be out in the woods. And there's something so awesome about being among the trees, being among the woods, and that we have so many different kind of trees here, which is really cool. And you start to notice all of that a lot more, I think, when you're really. It's the highlight of your day sometimes.
yeah, and it's not Arkansas, but you and I both live in Virginia, and I really appreciate what we have here as well. So really, really fortunate to be able to experience that. All right, folks. Well, that's all from Third Pod from the Sun.
Thanks so much to Shane for bringing us this story, and to Max for sharing his work with us.
This podcast was produced and mixed by me.
We'd love to hear your thoughts. Please rate and review us, and you can find new episodes wherever you get your podcast, or always at thirdpodfromthesun.com.
Thanks all, and we'll see you next time.